Welcome to Race Talk with Lane and Eugene. On this episode, Reverend Dr. David Billings, author, anti-racism educator, activist, and truth teller, speaks with us about his experiences and his book, Deep Denial, The Persistence of White Supremacy in U.S. History and Life. This episode originally aired June 9th, 2021. Welcome to Race Talk with Lane and Eugene. I am your host, Reverend Lane Cobb, and as I said, my co-host Eugene Holden is on travel this afternoon. And this afternoon, our guest is the Reverend Dr. David Billings, and our topic is Deep Denial, the Persistence of White Supremacy in U.S. History and Life. Dr. Billings is an author and an activist and an anti-racism educator and a truth teller. And I thoroughly enjoyed my very brief meeting with him. Eugene and I had about an hour with him on Zoom, just so he can get acquainted with us and vice versa. And boy, did I learn a lot. So let me just remind people that Race Talk is a loving, respectful, inclusive platform that encourages collaborative dialogue about these tough issues having to do with race, and that here on Race Talk, we practice radically inclusive love, and that we listen with compassion and an effort to understand, and that even if we do not understand or agree with what is being said, that we extend an open and respectful heart to everyone here. So we appreciate that. Reverend Billings, I know you're here somewhere.
I'm here.
Here you are. Awesome, awesome. All right, so let me introduce you if that is okay. And do you like to be called Reverend Billings or Dr. Billings?
Either one, either one.
Either one. All right, here we go. Can't wait for this conversation. So, Reverend Dr. David Billings is a leader of anti-racist workshops, a historian, organizer, and ordained United Methodist minister. He has worked for over half a century now in the struggle for racial justice. He was born in Macomb, Mississippi. He knew his father and uncles rubbed shoulders with the Ku Klux Klan, but somehow did not succumb to the race hatred the group espoused. It would take years for the young Billings to fully understand his family's complex example of human decency. And by the time he did, he had long since packed his suitcase of contradictions and joined the nationwide fight against racism. He candidly acknowledges that even decades later, not all these contradictions are merely a part of his past. Deep Denial is Billings' first book, and it chronicles his coming of age as a white Southern activist, the disappointing turn away from the victories of the old civil rights movement and the new civil rights movement, and the history of white supremacy in America. Billings argues that white supremacy, although a well-documented history unknown to most Americans, profoundly shapes our laws as well as our collective psyche. Even the most committed anti-racist activists are not immune to its influence on ourselves, our nations, and our times. And for sure, that is the truth. Dr. Billings, welcome, welcome, welcome. I don't have to tell you that your book is amazing. There's so many folks here that have read your book and are excited to be hearing you either for the first time or again. And if you haven't seen the book, folks, here is the book, my dog-eared copy. It's awesome. I wanted to say, Dr. Billings, that I was relating the good time that Eugene and I had meeting you, and there are three things that you said that I just want to share before I turn the mic over to you. And that one is race is the thing that undergirds privilege and oppression. The other is that anti-Blackness has not always been a phrase, but it has always been here. And the third is the race construct has robbed us of our humanity and our souls have suffered. Denials of racism and its effects are destructive to our well-being. And that was just cut right to the heart of it for me. So without further chit chat from me, sir, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Reverend Cobb, and I'm honored to be here and to meet all of you on this Zoom. Some of your names are familiar to me and a few of the faces. Yes, I'm David Billings, and thank you for that introduction, which is duly exaggerated, but nonetheless, thank you for it. Yeah, you know, even before this country was official, it was decided that we would be a race-constructed nation. At first, people sort of wanted to recreate the European class system, and yet, if you did that, then there would be more class-based oppression than the founders could withstand. They could be overthrown. So the notion that at the time a fairly new conception of race, it was just being developed in Europe, and what became the United States became the pilot project, if you will. And race would be based on extermination policy of the indigenous and the enslavement policy of Africans being brought here against their will. And every institution in the United States, every one of them, part of larger systems, were created with white people in mind, people who became white, which was also a new phenomenon and first practiced in the United States, so that the peoples from Europe would be classified or come to be called white, which was a legal term, which meant that you had individual access to the institutions sanctioned by the state, and you had collective power, so that white people, people called white, regardless of any other oppression, and there are many, but if that adjective fronts your name, it means that you have a special relationship to structural power, so that even the poorest white or the most oppressed white had advantages that, aligning themselves with persons of color, would threaten. So most of us who are white, with exceptions, chose race over class or any other form of oppression. Now, when I began this work as a part of a group of people from around the United States some 40 years ago, I had already grown up in Mississippi that had very restrictive race categories and race law. In fact, in Mississippi, you could commit treason against the state, and that was enforced by a sovereignty commission, which could judge whether or not you were to be allowed to stay in the state. So by the time I met a group of people in New Orleans that would call themselves, after a while, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, I was very familiar, had been seeped in white supremacy, had been taught white supremacy by a friend of mine, Nib Stroop, who said, I was taught white supremacy by people who loved me, meaning everyone from my parents to my teachers to my preachers they all taught me white supremacy as normative, as without question, as a natural order of things. So, you know, I denied much of it over the years. I would say I was no longer that person, that I had worked for racial justice all these years. And yet I knew at a certain level that anything out there that was a message for a person like me, and really others who would say they were unlike me, if it was out there in the societal ether, so to speak, then I internalized it. I might have squashed it, but I internalized it. And at certain points, those growing edges would come out. I might not say them out loud. I might just think them, but they were there. And so the book that Reverend Cobb referred to, Deep Denial, is my contention that all of us who are white in this country internalize messages of superiority, regardless of how much or how long or how otherwise oppressed, that are somewhere inside of us. And so being able to acknowledge that is a liberatory idea, in my opinion. Let me give you one example, then we'll see if there are any questions that you might want to make sure I address. This summer, I lived once again in New York City in the Northwest Bronx, in a section called Riverdale. There was a Black Lives Matter march. It was it was hundreds of people of all races, different classes of people. They were marching against a number of things, but certainly actions of the police that were going on nationwide, the killings of particular persons that were going on nationwide. And they were marching out in front of my apartment. Now, I no longer have full mobility, so I did not join the march, but I began to wonder, hearing the marchers chant, feeling their rhythm. I said, what would they do? What would I do if they knocked on my door? And if I opened the door, who would they see? Would they see an aging white man in their 70s, in my 70s, who had felt that he had been a part of liberation struggles since his late teens? Is that who they would see? Or would they see someone who at least physically embodied everything they were marching against, that was very symbol physically of white supremacy? And I was afraid. I really felt fear. And for maybe the first time, I admitted to myself that I had not lived one day of my life, not one day of my life, without the protective umbrella of white supremacy. Neither had my parents and their generation. Neither had my grandparents and their generation. And however many generations I would go back to the pre-foundation of this country based on race. That was an eye-opener, because my self-image was one of an anti-racist community organizer, one who organized with others across all the various lines. And all of that is true enough. But what is also true was that everything I had in this life, and because of this nation's race construct, had to do with my relationship to power, and my relationship to power was ultimately based on white supremacy. So I felt if when I look back over my years, in some ways, in 1980, let's say, when the People's Institute formed, people were open, people were shocked at the analysis. They had not heard definitions, they had not been implicated by definitions that they heard us sharing. And there was a refreshment, there was an honesty. People hit their growing edge. And when those of us in the facilitating roles said, you know, all white people are racist, meaning that we are by intent the racially empowered people of a race-constructed nation, regardless of how else we might see ourselves, that we are the intended beneficiaries. So the difference is that today, in my opinion, some 40 or 50 years later, everybody knows everything. Everybody has read the books, they say. You know, everybody knows how to quote from a college professor that race is a structural, is a social construct. Everybody knows the right things to say. Everybody, to use the vernacular of the day, is woke. But the nation hasn't changed. The disparities, the unfairness, the discrimination, the prejudice is as real today as it has ever been. And this is not just among the haters. You know, this is not just among those who might have politics that we say are on the right. It is also among those of us who see ourselves as progressives. The lives we lead, the places we live, the investments that we can hand down to our grandchildren if we so choose, the relationship to the police, every facet of life, even those of us who speak out against it, march against it, organize against it, still benefit from it. And yet we are so often in denial about it. That's the big difference in my 50 years. You might have different experiences. Mine is that we are still in a state of denial. And so I now ask people in a workshop, I ask people in organizations that say, you know, we're intended to be anti-racist. I said, okay, well, let's introduce ourselves, and here's one ground rule. Don't tell me what you know. Don't tell me what you know or how long you've known it. Tell me what your growing edge is, what gets you, what makes you hit the wall, so to speak. What is it in your life where even if you don't say it out loud and you're white, you feel something. You feel something. It's taken from your head to somewhere. I won't say your heart. Maybe it's your gut. But tell me where you hit the wall, even privately. Because this knowing everything business, and I'm exaggerating to make a point, this surety that we have, that somehow we're on, we the good white people. Well, that remains to be seen. And you've got to have some people of color who will attest to your goodness. My experience is that at some level, people will say, well, David, you all right. You're pretty good, but you'll get white on us in a minute. The first time I was told that years ago, for once, I didn't have anything to say. I said, what do you mean I get white on you in a minute? And they said, well, don't get so excited, I mean, just that. Wherever you are, I was working in public housing in New Orleans at the time, along with a cohort of others. And they would say, wherever you are is corporate headquarters. Doesn't matter what your title is. Doesn't matter what you say your politics are. You represent power, and all of us know it. And thus, if you working late, we stay up late, making sure that nothing happens to you, because in your confused self, you can get us hurt, you can get us killed. That's kind of my opening statement. And Reverend, I don't know if you have other questions you want to make sure I address, but that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. I try not to kid myself as to what this society, we have a little part of the workshop, because people get used to being called racist, they're going to call you a racist, and so you kind of steel yourself for that moment. And then you get past it. And at some point, my partners would see us do that. And they would say, well, tell me this. You can acknowledge yourself as a racist. What do you like about it? What do you like about being white? Oh, man. I don't know what I'd rather have been called. But don't ask me to say out loud in mixed company, meaning racially, or in front of Black people in particular, what I like about being white. I had to admit, hell, I like everything about it. Everything about it. Some of some of the participants say, I don't like nothing about it. And then they'd say, I've never thought about it. How in the world, in a setting like the United States, if you're called white, can you say, I've never thought about being white? Because you know what's coming. If you ask a Black person, you ever think about race? They'll say, yeah, I'm thinking about it as you're talking. I think about it every moment of every day. My life depends on it, but you don't have to think about it at all. I really am stopping here, Rev.
Well, please don't stop because I know I speak for everybody. We're fascinated listening to you. And here's what I would say, right? We're going to have a conversation. I know that folks are going to have a lot to ask you and contribute to the conversation. But one of the things that you said in your opening statement was either acknowledging whiteness is liberatory, or did you say acknowledging racism is liberatory? And it's probably a little bit of both. But what did you say? And could you expand on that a little bit, please? Because I love that statement.
Yeah, it is liberation because, I really equate acknowledging whiteness and acknowledging racism. It's really the same thing. You can fine tune it. You can understand each of those histories, but really whiteness, the creation of whiteness, the being able to own it as a white person, and to, in my opinion, owning it and embracing how important it is to you. And it is proven how important it is by basically every decision that we make in life. Now, often we will be silent. It's very interesting. White people know everything in one sense as a collective. We speak on every subject. We have degrees, many of us, out the kazoo. We run institutions and organizations disproportionately, even when our constituency, those whom we purport to serve or ally ourselves with, are overwhelmingly people of color. All over the nation, those organizations that purport to serve them are overwhelmingly white. 83% of the public schools teachers are white, even as the public schools become more and more persons of color. Every systemic outcome in this nation, from healthcare to education to social services, transport, it doesn't matter. Every outcome, you can't find one where you can't predict the outcome on the basis of race. White people disproportionately benefit. People of color, especially Black people, have disproportionately struggled to overcome the impact of race, whatever language you use. Wherever you go in the country, urban, small town, still the same. In fact, you don't even have to go. You can just say, well, just hum me a few bars. Who's in your jail? Who's more likely to perish as a result of COVID or whatever the epidemic of the day is? Now, I say all this not to beat up on people. It might sound like it, but I'm talking about myself too. What's liberatory about it is that when we finally, in my experience, tell the truth, own the truth, internalize the truth, and most crucially begin to live it out in our organizing efforts, then relationships across these race lines are possible. Most of us, we have very superficial relationships across lines of race, very superficial. Even sometimes if we're married or our significant other crosses race, the relationship when it comes to race, the honesty that comes with understanding it is very superficial, So I maintain that the more we hear the truth, work with that truth in a collective manner, the more we push our growing edge to not say what we know, what we've read, but what do we not know? What pushes our button? What helps us? What makes us hit the wall when the discussion of race? Now, one thing on what's now called anti-Blackness. This country's always been anti-Black. It's a term now that speaks to that reality. But every system in the United States was anti-Black, even before there were systems. Every system in the United States is intended to benefit white people. That's why those white people who don't seemingly benefit from it, even though everything is laid out for them, It's why we're called trash, throwaway, don't count. Well, that builds great anger, and we've experienced that in this nation. Everybody angry at each other. Everybody's in denial about what it is we're angry about. As hard as it is to believe, there are some of us who are white who believe that black folks got an advantage in this country. You know, that all the laws are shaped to, to benefit black people. And what did you do? Grow up under a rock or something? You know, where have you been? You know, it's incredible. And yet, many of us will insist upon it. So I think that we have to acknowledge, not just young people today will say that's performative, meaning you just saying it. You're just saying it because someone said that's what you're supposed to say. Or you just saying it if you're white to keep black folk off of you. You know, you just saying it. You don't believe that. None in your life, nothing indicates in your life that you understand racism and white supremacy. If all of us as progressives who say we understand it, actually do understand it, then we would have the possibility of a movement to undo racism. We could do it. Imagine if you couldn't get a law degree without demonstrating, not just by your words, but whatever the other criteria might be set up. It said in order to be a lawyer in a race-constructed nation, in order to interpret the law or defend someone impacted by those laws, there were criteria that you had to be able to demonstrate. Otherwise, you couldn't get such a degree. Same thing with being a doctor or any other healthcare professional or associate or aide. If you had to demonstrate in ways yet to be determined that you really do understand this nation's race construct and its intentions, and you go across the line into every profession, everything that might offer a degree before you get the certificate. After the murder of George Floyd, after the murder of Breonna Taylor, we had people calling us at the People's Institute who said, you know, we don't have the time to go through that 2-3 days workshop you do, but we'll pay you to just give a certificate saying that we did it. I said, what an arrogant son of a bitch would say something like that. You know, just give us the certificate. We would put it on our wall, but we don't have time. And excuse my language, good folks, but that is infuriating and dangerous, you know.
All right, sir. I'm glad I was on mute because I had some choice words I was saying. That is insane. Wow, the gall. And you know, it is interesting that there is that much gall. I want to invite people to begin raising their hands. Remember, we're going to ask you to keep your questions and comments to under a minute if you can. I wanted to engage you, sir, about something that you said in your book, talking about the victories of the civil rights movement that were unrealized or have been legislated away. Can you just speak to that a little bit? Because that's galling to folks as well, but can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, every one of those victories, Reverend, are under attack. every last one of them, that some on this screen risked their own lives and their own careers to make sure happened, are now under attack. I don't think we would ever get to the point where the very so-called democracy that we live under would now be questioned. And the reason that it's being questioned is that this democracy never internalized that Black people are fully human beings and thus protected by the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the United States. Once, because of their actions, because of their organizing, Black people would begin to insist that they be treated as full human beings and be covered by the Bill of Rights. Then those very foundations of the white democracy began to be questioned. And when I say Black people, I'm not meaning that other peoples of color have not suffered mightily under this race construct, and that many of us, or some of us who are called white, have not paid a price. I mean the mindset of the nation, the mindset of the systems of the nation. All of them were created to benefit white people. And all of them's outcomes say that this nation's systemic output is exactly the output that it was intended to produce, you know. Now, I don't say this just for shock value. I think that the hard truth has to be, you know, the Ma'afa, the great Marimba Ani, who would speak about, you know, the Ma'afa as being descriptive, a Kiswahili term that means great tragedy, utter pain, that described the so-called middle passage, that the way out of that, you have to go back through it. Well, I think the same is demanded of us who are white. We have to go back through it without denial and without subterfuge. So that's what I meant by that. Did that, Reverend, answer your question? Or
Oh, it does, and of course opens another question, which is, well, how do you see that happening, right? Because it's hard for me anyway, and many of the folks I talk to, not to be cynical, to think that lasting change really is possible. And what needs to happen in your view?
You know, I don't know if it is possible. You have to have hope. You have to say it is possible. I say it is when I speak and on these screens. You got to. If you don't think it's possible, then, you know, you're just, the pain is too much to bear. On the other hand, white supremacy kicks back, it pushes back. You see it. Some of us felt that even just last summer, a year ago, that we were on the verge of real, substantive, deep down, bone-chilling change in this country. And I thought, not in the country I live in. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be denial. Now watch what's happening. The very teaching of this kind of thing, race critical theory as it's called, antiracism for much of us. They're attempting to outlaw that, say it's a crime to teach that. You know, we can take your license, you know, all of these sort of things. We did a workshop some time ago, but not that long ago, within the past year, where people in a certain state had a 1-800 call number that if they were made to go to a workshop that spoke the truth about race in this country's history, there was a 1-800 number that you could call in the middle of the workshop and say, I was being forced to attend. This is serious business, what's going on in this nation. Because there are many now that say, if this nation is to change to the extent that all people are seen as fully human, then I don't want to live there. See, in our construct, only white people were fully human. Native peoples were to be removed from the land. We all know about the 3/5 compromise. We know that Mexico had to give up 51% of its land base to once it was, after the Treaty of Guadalupe. We know that in Haiti, that because it successfully organized a revolution, first time in the Western Hemisphere, that Black people had organized to the extent that even Napoleon gave up and said, hell, you can have it. You can have it for $15 million. There's a colleague of mine that says, really, the father of this country is Toussaint Louverture. Because until he demonstrated that white supremacy could be overthrown, no one thought it was possible. Yet the people of Haiti overthrew it. But you know what the kickback was? Ever since then, we've embargoed Haiti. We've isolated Haiti. It's the poorest, economically speaking, country in the Western Hemisphere. You pay a price. Now, where's the hope? The hope is somehow in the struggle that when we move from a position of denial to one of understanding, to that we can become fully human. And when you're fully human, we can affect solutions to problems that seem insurmountable. That's my hope.
Thank you. I love that.
That we can organize to undo what was done. It's probably not going to happen. I'm sure it's not going to happen in my lifetime. Maybe in the generations to come, it will. We're not there yet.
Certainly, thank you for the work that you are doing, sir. I see that now we have Norman and Judith. Norman, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
How you doing?
Okay.
I just had a question for Dr. Billings. Do you know much about the race problem in Cuba that brought about the break between the United States and Russia? The United States and Cuba regarding Russia?
Yeah, tell me more about it. I don't know as much as I should, but I can tell that you've done some study on that.
Yes,
or
I
you've
have.
lived it. Yeah.
And well, it wasn't me so much as Gerald Horn. He's a
Yes.
well. That whole thing was because they refused to institute the Jim Crow laws in Cuba.
All right.
And that was the reason that Cuba was ostracized. And we fought against them when they were not trying to hurt this country. They didn't want to hurt themselves because they had a society that was basically race-free.
Yes.
And that would have taken them back. And Kennedy, somebody that we revere in this country, was willing to start a war over this. And had Russia not gotten involved, who knows what would have happened.
Well, I'll study on that because that's enlightening. Thank you,
Sure.
Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Norman. Good to see you. Judith?
Unmute. I'm trying. This has just been. Thank you, David, for sharing what you have shared. What you have been talking about, and I came in a few minutes late, but what you have been talking about, I've been living it my entire life, and I'm sure that
Yes.
every African American on this screen has been living exactly what you're talking about, and every Caucasian person too, because of because what you've been basically describing to us through your examples, and you've been defining what systemic racism really is. Systemic racism began with the systemizing of race in this country for the purpose of power and free labor to build the economic foundation of this country. And,
Yes.
and it's been sustained because it still yields the benefits that it was
Yes.
established for in the first place. So
Yeah.
thank you for being truthful, for being honest, and and also for opening up possibilities for us to come together
Thank you.
as we learn and grow about the truth of the history of this country. Now, my question is, do you think that there's a relationship between the gun laws in Texas, California, and the people who are empowered to relax the gun laws? Do you think that there's a relationship to that, and as a backlash to the court's decisions with regards to George Floyd and holding police officers whose origin is the slave plantation in the first place? The policing began on the slave plantations and grew out of slavery. So now they're being held accountable through the courts. And we also see this release of guns and legislation that is making guns more accessible. I'm wondering if you see a connection between that and reaction to the decision in the George Floyd case and bringing more officers to the courtroom with regards.
Yeah. I not only agree with everything you said, Ms. Bevel, I think there's a straight line of connection. I think that I listened to Carol Anderson last night talk about her new book, Second Amendment, that the right to bear arms had all to do with the fear of an organized Black nation that would strike at the very heart of white supremacy. That what we talk about in this country as defending, I forget the wording, but a well-regulated militia. That militia didn't have anything to do with fighting the British. It had everything to do with ensuring that enslavement would continue. So I agree with everything you said, and that the use, probably the biggest fear this nation has had historically is Black people owning guns. And I'm not a proponent. Don't go say, you're speaking in favor of violence. No, I'm speaking in favor of knowing the truth, that the fear of an armed Black nation, whether it was Robert Williams in Monroe, North Carolina in 1961, or, the NRA in today's reality, the fear that every time there is Black resistance that gets on TV, you'll see the gun sales in this country skyrocket. And you're seeing them today reach record levels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Dr. Billings. Sarah Luderot has a question. Sarah, please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Billings. I actually went on Amazon and bought your book while you were talking, so I'm ready to go. I also like to say thanks to the technology. I'm actually calling in from Ghana, where race presents itself very differently. I've had a 50-year relationship with Ghana, but I live primarily now in the United States. So my question, even though my accent is funny, my question is about a parish work in the United States. In trying to promote a better understanding of racial issues post-George Floyd within our parish community, and it is a very diverse community. We have a lot of African members, a lot of Philippines, all over the world, actually. We're getting so much pushback. We're being told, go slow, don't rush, people are not ready. And even in a little piece that was put into our parish bulletin, they chose to talk about the Tulsa massacre as a race riot, which completely framed the issue wrong. So how do we crack open this situation? If you have any recommendations, none of our parishioners would call themselves racist, just as you say. We're all good Christian people. So
Yes.
how do we crack it open? How do we make some inroads without, I mean, maybe we have to be confrontational, but too much confrontation is not going to be productive. Any suggestions would be very welcome.
Well, one, and you already know this, and you know, but most so-called race riots in this nation's history have to do with white race riots, and yet they're hardly ever referred to as such. Black folk are always somehow blamed for racial rioting, as they are for most other things, because it gives us comfort to be able to blame Black people and their anger. Watch how Black women are portrayed in the media in this country who are supporters of Black Lives Matter. Almost always an angry posture, fist raised, mouth open, which is designed not to educate us around, in my opinion, the justness of their cause, but to strike fear in those of us who are watching the news, you know, and that's why you will hear those of us who've never said all lives matter, when in fact we see signs that say Black Lives Matter. All of a sudden we become humanist. We become world citizens. You know, we say, don't all lives matter? Well, where were you yesterday before you heard Black Lives Matter? See, that came about, in my understanding, those women who, you know, that's a movement, not an organization. Now white folks are asking for accountability. Where's all the money gone? You know, who's being held accountable for how Black Lives Matter spending that money? Well, who's being held accountable for the senseless murders? Not just recently, not just the last 10 years. You would think that in white society, that the first Black people murdered by the police was Michael Brown, you know, and Ferguson. And yet, any study of this nation's history would know that even before we were a nation, that the murder of Black people by authorities was commonplace, was encouraged, and hardly ever prosecuted, you know. But we live in a nation of denial where the truth is somehow prohibited. We think it's too, you know, we say, well, if you have a white child, at what age should you start teaching them about it, letting them know about racism? I said, well, now, how would a black parent answer that question? And if it's in the womb, then start there. If it's before, start there. Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Kids can handle the truth a lot better than those of us often who are adults. And you can tell it in the voices of our children. Well, that's not fair. They know intuitively what we have to unpack intellectually. So, you know, these, it's something that we will never be what we want to be unless we understand the truth of this nation's history. There are a lot of things that are positive. Why don't we teach about not just the heroes and sheroes that are Black, and there are many millions, or indigenous, or whatever other color construct or code we use. But there are a lot of white people who've fought this, but we don't learn about them in history either, you know? So we need to tell the truth, not just of white apologists, but of white resistors.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, Dr. Billings, I am always struck by the strange relationship that the United States seems to have with the truth.
Yes.
It's just very strange. So Zulma, I saw your hand go up, but I saw it go down. So let me know if you'd like me to call on you. Right now, I'm going to go to Jeff, and then to Barbara Bird, and then to Tina.
Yeah, thank you. First I want to thank Tyrone for his chat about white allies, you know, to speak up. So you were talking about where our edges, where my edges, where I hit the wall, and I got in touch with something that you know, showing up here at Race Talk is meaningful to me, but it's safe. It's a very safe thing for me to do. I'm participating in a group with Tyrone. I really am benefiting a lot from it. I enjoy the connection, but it's safe. When I go help at the East Oakland Boxing Association, giving out food, same thing. And what I'm looking at as you're talking, Dr. Billings, is where, you know, where is it not safe for me? You know, I'm not feeling, one of the things I'm aware of is I don't feel the anger that would propel me into taking action that would be unsafe. I'm just watching it. I get moved deeply by seeing certain things, you know, George Floyd, et cetera, but it's easy for me to go back into my white world and just enjoy being white, you know, and go out when they're safe. So I'm going to examine where it would be unsafe. And, you know, the first thought that came up to me, there was a TV program that was on for a while where a person who was somebody who was very, very rich lived with a family that was very, very poor for a month. And living with that family transformed his whole attitudes towards wealth and poverty. And my first thought was, wow, maybe I can live with a Black family in East Oakland for a week, see what it's like, to see what it feels like. Because how else can I experience it, man? It's just all in my head. It's all intellectual. It's all, you know, nothing's visceral. And I don't know how else, you know, I have to examine that within myself. But I'm going to kind of look at, just ask myself the question, where would it be unsafe for me that would make me, like, we call it in my organization, I work with men's organization, we call it the gulp factor. If you don't have the gulp factor, then nothing's going to help you move forward. You know, you have to feel like the gulp factor. So I'm going to I need to look at that. You know, where would it be unsafe for me to move into the next level of taking some action? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And it can be answered, you know, each of us, if we get more and more honest, you know, we get to those edges, so to speak. It's what I meant by the story I told at the beginning about meeting the protesters at my doorway and who would they see. Yeah, you know, we've got to, we're not a very honest nation. We don't know how to speak to each other. And but that's where we have to build relationships that start closest to us. You know, some of us with the most radical of language can't talk to our own family, you know, so it calls into question the radical rhetoric. If you can't talk to your mother and daddy, if you can't talk to your sisters with the same sort of forthrightness, then it calls into question. And I'm not talking about shouting at people, but just building relationships with folks that are closest to us and spiraling out from there. That takes, as you said, Jeff, a lot of contemplation, meditation, sitting with yourself, not to the point of impotence, but in order to get somewhere. It's very hard to get that level of honesty.
Thank you.
Lane, you're muted.
Oh, I apologize. Thank you so much. I was thanking Jeff, and I love that the gulp factor. It's amazing. I too was struck by that question. What makes you hit the wall? Excellent question for everyone. Barbara, could you unmute? And then we're going to have Tina ask her question, and then Norman.
Okay, thank you, Lane, Reverend Lane. I wanted to ask about when, for instance, recently, the vice president and president taking the oath to uphold the Constitution. I've always had an inkling that I don't want to uphold a white Constitution. I don't think it's fair, but they pledged to do this, and I'm wondering if their pledge is to uphold racism then. I am conflicted when they say that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we should be at this, you know, it's what is called originalist interpretation of the Constitution. And there are people on the Supreme Court who will say that's who they are, originalists. Well, that is one mean document. If you're seen as less than fully human in the original Constitution, then maybe that is what people are thinking. It certainly is for many of us who say, you know, let's make America great again. Well, how far back we taking that? You know, what do we really mean by it? But these things are, you know, that Constitution, which on the one hand has been responsible for some of the advances we've made in this society. It is also a document that wasn't written for Black people. You know, you weren't a part of the social contract. They weren't fully human when the Bill of Rights were written. So for whom was it written? These are things we struggle with, not in order to get so depressed that we can't act, but to understand that if we are going to act, it needs to be from a foundation of truth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All righty. Tina.
Hi, I don't have a question as just reflection. I appreciate Tyrone encouraging white allies to speak out, because that's, you know, that's an edge for me to speak where I'm at. But I was certainly thinking when David was talking about where our edge is, and you know, I think the experience I remember having is when Trump was elected. My daughter was in 8th grade at the time, and she said, "How's this going to affect us?" And my husband kind of honestly said, "Well, for us personally, maybe not a whole lot." And, you know, it probably became the first time in my life I became aware of how privileged I was, and that awareness has continued to, you know, be more acute with COVID and things. And I think my next edge is kind of like Jeff was talking about, finding places where that are a little less safe for me, and honestly having meaningful connections with people of color. I live in a very you know, homogenous neighborhood. The church I'm part of is pretty homogenous. So I need to find, I mean, I'm doing a lot of activism. I work with a group that is, their part is about trying to reach out to people of color in suppressed states to inform them, to encourage them to vote. So that feels like a safe action. It's something I can do in a very controlled way, but to have more honest conversations with people from, you know, from people of color is probably my next edge. And in a way, this is a trial. This is sort of a training ground doing it here, because kind of speaking this awkward truth and not sure how it's, anyway, that's, I just wanted to share that because I know that part of it is taking risks and being honest. So thank you.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Tina. And you're welcome to speak anytime. Your voice matters. Norman.
Okay. Speaking about this feeling safe, the unsafe place to talk is everywhere you hear something wrong. Everywhere. And that's in every interaction that you have with white people. Speak up. My family and I don't really get along very well because they think I'm a racist, and I can't explain to them that it's impossible for me to be a racist. I don't have any power. You have to have power to be a racist. You have to have privilege to be a racist. Don't have any of that. They don't buy that, but it's the truth. When you, well, just in all your interactions, just talk to the people around you. If they say something that's not, that you know is wrong, let them know. That's it.
I hear you, Norm.
Thank you, Norman.
You render me mute. Yeah.
Gail.
Well, I'm speaking up also after Tyrone's invitation. Thank you very much, I think, Tyrone. I'm not going to go through, you know, a list of things that I'm doing, but I do want to share an inner conflict that I've been struggling with. I'm a white Jewish woman, and the only adjective in that list that makes me feel privileged and powerful is white.
Right.
Being a Jew and a woman, I feel strips me of my power. I know that even with my white privilege, history shows that it can be taken away from me and my people. There's even a history of conflict between Afro-Americans and Jews, where Jews withdrew from the active support of Black people so as not to lose the privilege that was being granted to them. So How do Jews and Blacks see the need to join together in force? How to get all marginalized people to see that we're all that's where my conflict, I can't seem to get my head on top of that.
Well, you're absolutely correct. As long as that adjective white is in front of whatever comes after it, you're in a certain racial status in this country. And same with women. As long as that white is there, you're talking about another reality than that if you were said to be a woman or a man of color. Again, it goes back to the history. In 1790, this country will pass the first Naturalization Act. Now internalize this. The first act of the new nation will be an act that says only white people, not white men, not rich white men, not landed white men, only white people can immigrate to the United States and begin the process of citizenship. Not that citizenship was immediately granted. Also check the inheritance laws that have been since the formation of the nation, where going back to the first president, that what made him the wealthiest president, some still say in the nation's history, was not the wealth that he brought to the nation, but the wealth he inherited from Martha, his wife, who, what would one say? She deeded to him 150 Africans. That was his inheritance. It is a mythology, given our structural arrangements in this country and how wealth is passed from one generation to the next, to look for some discrimination, and not that you were doing this, but many of us do, then say, I'm not a part of this arrangement. You are. The debate that was in the first preparation of the first census. How are we going to classify Jewish people? Anti-Semitism is real. The oppression of Jewish people would be automatic and historic. Yet, in the nation's mindset, they'll be classified as white, although it was known that most Jews worldwide would be Black. So what are the discussions? As Norman said, the discussions are about power. The discussions are not about ultimately who's prejudiced and who's not. We all are prejudiced. It's impossible to live in the United States. Even if you just got here, you'll bring race prejudice with you, because of how we've exported this nation worldwide. But it's about power. So when they're looking at power, they said, is there a natural corollary between oppressed people, to use our language today? Are there natural connections because of the oppression? And that'll be in large measure why white would be invented. There was no European who came here early on as a white person, became white in the United States. The idea that the Jewish people would become white, and that just when that was is a point of argument for some. But let's say after World War II, as the Black nation is organizing to end Jim Crow and Jane Crow, then we realized that the alliance between Jews and Blacks had been, who shook the very foundation of this nation. So how are we going to divide them? How are we going to make sure that doesn't continue? You know, well, let's stress whiteness. Same thing we're doing today. We're always on the lookout in this country for the next white people. You know, I'll let you decide who are the next white people, who has, you know, been marginalized and yet is now necessary to maintain the arrangement, not an oppression-free arrangement, the race arrangement, you know. And this nation always searches historically for people who were once not seen to be white, but now have become white. Because we're an ahistorical nation, if it didn't happen in the last decade, a lot of us, it never happened. We don't know how this happens, you know, but it happens very intentionally. It happens in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different settings, you know. Reverend Cobb mentioned that I was a United Methodist minister, which means I'm a Christian and a Protestant. But, you know, I had to come to grips with that and realize that even the Christ I worship had to succumb to white supremacy, you know, had to be taught as white, had to be pictured as white. You might say, well, you know, you're just nitpicking. No, I'm not, you know, because you can't have white supremacy and then have the divine depict an alternate reality. So Jesus had to become white, regardless of how many times you might quote the songs of Solomon. Jesus, it was necessary, you know. That's why in the United States, until very recently, white people were defined as any of the original peoples, I'm paraphrasing, of Europe, comma, the Middle East, or Northern Africa. I said, damn, the Middle East or Northern Africa, what was that? You know, well, the Middle East might be sort of obvious. Jesus had to be white because your depiction of the divine couldn't contradict your racial supremacist thinking. You know, the Northern Africa, even those of us who became white and took over the ultimate racial category by those who invented race, we all acknowledged that Northern Africa was the seeds of world civilization. So we can't say Africa without making the distinction somehow that Northern Africa is different than Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, what was the difference? Race, always race. There is no issue in this country, nothing, in my opinion, that doesn't have race as an integral part of its reality. From where you go to the movie to where you shop for groceries, nothing, you know? Now, how do we overcome that? How do we go beyond that? And I don't have all the answers for that, but I know we've got to start with truth telling, and we've got to undergird truth with love. I see Eddie Freed on the screen somewhere, Eddie. And Eddie is always speaking about his organizing in his Unitarian church, and how if he doesn't speak a language of love, no one is going to listen to whatever else he might have to say. That stays with me because I can come across as very polemic. I can come across as, very divisive. But I try to understand what it means to truly love yourself, someone else. And that's not easy, but it's as necessary.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, that takes us almost to closing time. And I know we have people that want to ask questions. But what you said, and thanks for taking us to church there, Dr. Billings. I'm going to start to put some things in the chat just for some resources, guys. People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, the Antiracism Racist Alliance, and also something else that's happening locally next week. However, having said that, we do have time. I know that Tyrone and Eugene is also here. So Tyrone, go ahead and ask your question. I'm going to start typing, and then Eugene, I'm going to let you have the last dialogue with Dr. Billings. And Adine and Jason, thank you so much. Please come back next week. I'm sorry that we don't have time for your questions today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elaine. And I'm digging the background. Race. There's no revolution without love. I really like that in your backdrop. Dr. Billings, you're killing me with the red hat. I just wanted to let you know that.
Hey, it looks good, doesn't it?
Awesome, dude. You look great in it. So 4 quick points. One is that I think we need to start having white studies programs instead of black studies programs. I think it would be very effective for people to really get that at another level. And I said 4 quick 5 points. The next one is that the deepest journey we can take is within ourselves. The deepest place we can go to challenge all this stuff is within ourselves. The deeper we look, and that's important. And I just say that, anyway, I'll move on. And the last thing is about labels. And I like to ask this question, we don't want to be viewed in a certain way in our society, right? And for a lot of white folks, you don't want to be viewed as a racist, but you don't want to be viewed as a white radical. So, we get stuck in labels, instead of going deeper and digging for the truths. And to really love yourself means you have to tell the truth. To really, really deeply love yourself means you got to look at the stuff you don't love. That's true love, is to look at that. I'm out.
Thank you, Tyrone.
It's the birthday boy. Yes, Eugene.
So I am here. So can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Billings, thank you so very much. And I have to voice what my brother Tyrone said. I said this the first time you and I met. I love your hats. So I want to take it back to that issue of feeling safe to speak up, right? And as I was listening to Jeff speak and other people talk about that, what came to mind very quickly is that in this thing called systemic racism, fear, of course, was infused within that. Fear of people who don't look like white folks, right? And all of that, and then made it very fearful to even talk about it. And then now let's also construct this system where you are safe, right? So the question is, how do you feel safe enough to speak up? And then the other question is, are you willing to be courageous enough to feel uncomfortable? Are you willing to feel uncomfortable? Are you willing to be courageous enough to feel uncomfortable? And all of that really comes back to that thing called love, right? Do I love myself enough to put myself out there to say, you know what, I don't really understand what's going on, but I don't like it. There's something is not right here. Can we have a conversation? So I just wanted to bring it back to that thing called safety, because the only way that I can feel safe is when I feel that I am safe. Now I understand that there are things going on out there that may have me pull back because I don't feel safe. But when we start looking at a systemic construct that affects everybody, that should be angering almost everybody except for those who are tapped into that construct. If we allow ourselves to be angry enough, there's a saying that we won't change anything until we get mad enough to change it. That's all. Feel safe. Be comfortable. Be willing to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Dr. Billings, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you with us this afternoon. I want to tell people who we've got next week, but I also want to ask you if there are any particular trainings that you would highly recommend. We have some that have gotten into the chat. I've already put in PSAB and antiracistalliance.com. Anything that you would recommend that we look up specifically?
Check out the work of Joyce James. She's out of Texas. She's in the foster care. She used to be the, whatever you call it, statewide foster care director, but she has an approach to how you deal with systemic change at an organizing level that I find very helpful. And the Anti-Racist Alliance and Sandy Burnaby here in Westchester, she always lists Joyce James workshops on her list. I find those valuable. The Race Equity Institute out of North Carolina. There are a lot of different workshops now. You might wonder why there are so many. And I'll just say one thing in closing to that. White supremacy depends on fragmentation. Mm-hmm. So it will encourage as many voices in the room as possible to have their own take. And while that's important, it's also one of the reasons that we can't organize to undo. It's why for most of us in this country, particularly who are white, if asked to define racism, if there are 25 of us in the room, you'll have 25 different definitions. That is not an accident. Right. You have to have a working definition in order to, not that you all agree, but that you all agree to use as you try to build a collective. So I hope that I've really enjoyed this. I knew I would the first time I met Reverend Cobb and Reverend Eugene Holden. And so, you know, sometimes you don't feel at home in these kind of settings, but they made me and each feel at home. And so I appreciate it. And thank you. And I like to discuss these things. So I live on Zoom these days, so you can zoom in and ask me something if you were mine too.
I have you on tape. Now that I have you on tape that you have said that, believe me, I'm going to zoom in a whole lot. You're going to have to tell me to leave. And so thank you. And we hope that you will come back. We're certainly going to invite you back,
Anytime you ask.
Folks, please join us next week. We will be joined by Ms. LaTanya Myers, who is a prison abolitionist and community organizer working with the organization Above All Odds in Philadelphia. And she is a spitfire. You want to be here for that one. All right, everybody. We love you. Dr. Billings, take care.
Bye now.
Brother Eugene, don't party too hard. We love you. Take care. Have a great week,
Happy
everybody.
birthday,
Bye-bye.
Eugene. I know you.
Thank Thank you. I know you too.
Happy birthday, Eugene.